Hi everyone, it's Mochi Makes, and today we're going to be going over my embroidered patch tutorial using this test file that's included with this video. So first of all, we're going to open up our design software. I personally use Hatch by Wilcom. This is Hatch 2, and you can see here that we have this sample patch image. I Love You Drooly, very cute pet patch, and it's just in this 4x4 square. And you can see here that the patch's first step is that placement stitch, and that's going to be the base of the patch. And in our settings here, we can set the type of stitch, which in this case is a running stitch, and then that ultimately is covered by the satin stitch, which is the final stitch. So the key here is that the outline placement stitch is smaller than the final satin stitch. So it's going to be completely covered up at the end of the day, but it being that ever so slightly bit smaller allows us to hide that raw edge of our patch when we go to pop it out of the hoop. And you can see the other steps here, the text and the tatami fill here for the design. Really simple design. The file is included with this video for anyone interested. And this is just how I typically lay out my patches, where I do the placement stitch, the satin stitch, and then all the details afterwards. If anyone's interested in learning more about the Hatch software, I highly recommend John Deere's Embroidery Legacy. You can find him on YouTube and on his designated website. Now that our patch design is done, we can go ahead and load it onto our machine, and let's get ready to embroider it. So per our design, you could see that the first color that was teal in our design is actually just the placement stitch, so it doesn't matter what physical color that you do load up into your machine here. So since I'm doing this all actually just in one color, so you can see the high contrast between the patch felt and the design, everything is done in gray regardless of what the design sheet says. So here we go with our outline stitch that we use for our felt placement. Important to note here, I'm using tearaway stabilizer in my hoop for all of my patch projects per the instructions. This placement stitch is also a great time to check your tension before continuing on with your design, so you don't mess up the design because you didn't realize the tension was messed up. Next up, we're going to grab our special patch felt. This is a 2mm thickness variety that I do sell in my shop, link down below. And what we're going to do is that we're going to place this really stiff, thick felt over our placement stitch in just a minute. But here you can see some close-up shots of just how thick it is. It's a very, very densely packed polyester felt. What we're going to do is that we're going to cut a square or rectangle shape out of our felt that will completely cover that placement stitch, and then just place it right into the hoop, right underneath the needle. The next color in our design sheet is a basting stitch to hold the felt down. You could just as easily spray this with tacky spray before placing it, but because it's such a small patch, I prefer just to use a basting stitch. So you can see here we have this nice high contrast outline against our black felt, and this is just to highlight how close to this basting stitch we're going to have to trim so that the raw edges of the felt after we do trim it down are completely covered by the satin stitch that ultimately is the edge of the patch. So what we're going to do now in order to trim this excess felt is that we're going to remove it from the machine and trim it down using that basting stitch as a guide for the edge of our scissors to trim really, really, really close. I personally use angled duckbill scissors when I'm trimming my patches to get really, really close to that basting stitch. You can see here, however, that I didn't do a great job for the purposes of this video, and I have these jagged little edges sticking out, and these will be a problem later on. Next is our satin stitch outline to cover the raw edges of that felt. You can see here that because I didn't trim down the jagged edges well enough, they're now sticking out of my satin stitch when it really should be cleanly, completely covering the edge. This is why trimming is so important. Yay, our satin stitch is now complete. We can see here the difference between the satin stitch and the felt. Unfortunately, those jagged little edges are still peeking through our satin stitch. Still, we can see how our satin stitch almost completely covered the entirety of the raw edge of our patch felt here. You can see already that the very stiff polyester felt that's super dense provides a great sturdy base and foundation for our patch, so it's not flimsy and not going to warp or adjust itself when we go to embroider the rest of the design. Next, we're going to move on and embroider the inside portion of our patch design. So while the machine does its thing and it goes and embroiders the entirety of the paw featured in the design and the text, I just want to go over the reason why everything is done physically on the machine in a gray stitch versus the design sheet being in gray and purple. A big challenge I find with embroidery is the difference between the machine instructions and the human instructions. So the design sheet, you often have to trick the machine into giving you these opportunities to lay down the fabric or trim it, or place different materials to do applique style by changing the color in the machine instructions, but as a human that you're going to load a completely different color. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you are designing things, especially for patches, is that because I need to place the felt down over my placement stitch, I need to signal that to the machine by changing the color. And for me, that means usually using a teal color to denote my placement stitch, and then moving on and doing my other designs in other colors as part of the same patch. You notice that the text was done in purple, and that's because normally I like to trim between the main patch graphic and any text before moving on. So that's just something to keep in mind. Common with many machines, the difference between machine instructions and human instructions. So now our stitch out is complete. We can remove the hoop from the machine, and I'll just hold it up here so you can admire the complete design. We have a great tension all throughout the patch here. The next thing we're going to do is just quickly trim any missed jump stitches. Normally these are removed by the machine itself. And here we are, our patch is looking pretty great. Even with those jagged little edges, it looks awesome. So here, just to go over the patch in more detail, you can see the tatami stitch that was used for the paw print, the satin stitch for the text, and the satin stitch outline of the patch. All the tension here is awesome. Even with the jagged little edges that I'm pointing out here, we'll just burn those off in the end, and we'll still get a really nice looking patch at the end of the day. Our next step is to physically pop the finished patch out of the hoop, and this is exactly why we chose tearaway stabilizer, because we are able to remove it cleanly and don't have to cut away any stabilizer here. So there you go. And on quick review of the patch, you can see the underlying proof of our good tension throughout it, and I'm just going over and checking that there's nothing that I've missed in the design or anything like that I want to change, or anything else that I might do differently next time. But other than that, we have a really clean patch, and the big part of the felt is that we didn't have to bother with a fill stitch, because the black felt functionally is our fill stitch in this design. Look at those crisp satin edges. For this next part, I do advise to be careful because we are going to be handling fire. Please be careful not to burn yourself on this next step. This is the final step in our patch. We're going to burn away any of the jagged edges and loose embroidery thread from our design, essentially melting off these fuzzy little bits on the end. The patch featured in this close-up is another copy of the same design I made just for this little clip. It does feature bad tension. Please check your tension before doing the design completely. You can see just how close I'm getting to melt off all the fuzzy little bits. In this close-up, you can see exactly why we use flame to melt away the excess material, because we get this nice crisp edge all around our patch. And if I had done a better job at trimming, we wouldn't see any of the black felt peeking out from underneath the satin stitch here. And so all the more reason to trim appropriately in the process. Now we can admire our fully completed patch here. You can see on the back that you could apply any HeatnBond to turn it to an iron-on patch if you wanted, but all in all, it's a really cute design, and because we saved on that fill stitch by using felt, we have a really efficient process, and it's going to be a really sturdy, durable patch for whatever folks want to apply it onto. Because the patch is using 2mm thick felt, you get really crisp color differentiation as well, and it's going to be really durable. You can see here I can bend it and it snaps back into shape. Thanks for watching. This was my first ever tutorial, and I hope to do more of them on the software and how to efficiently produce patches. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.